Joining us live for more on this is James Brown, resident fellow at the United States Studies Centre. James, thank you for your time. Just how significant a development is this, drafting these articles? It's a step that's completely up to the Democrats, but they wouldn't be doing it if they didn't think they could move forward.
Well, I think Nancy Pelosi is right. They had no choice but to move these impeachment articles forward. Having held the 2 months of hearings, they couldn't walk away from the issue now. It would be a defeat for them. It now moves to the Judiciary Committee. They've narrowed the terms somewhat. They're not looking at impeaching him for treason. The charges will focus on bribery and obstruction of Congress and obstruction of justice. It will go to the House Judiciary Committee for a vote, and then it will then be put before the full House to vote on. You would expect at this stage both of those votes would be successful, and then it will go to the Senate, where you can almost guarantee that it will be unsuccessful in convicting the president and impeaching him properly.
Because there are a few precedents for an impeachment inquiry successfully going the course, but do you think at this point that that is a likely outcome?
Look, I think the House at this stage will vote to impeach the president. I think there will be a trial. I don't think he'll be convicted in that trial by the Senate. The Republicans will use their majority there to shut that down and to mount their defence against the Democrats. Essentially, the Republican argument against the Democrats is that the evidence is not strong, that they're wasting everybody's time, and that they're not focusing on the issues that matter to American voters. For the Democrats, they say that the issues are clear-cut. The president attempted to use his position to extol effectively a personal political dividend from his actions in US foreign policy. So I'm not sure that the Democrats got quite what they were looking for this week in having a number of law professors testify that these were impeachable offences. That seems to be beyond the point. Ultimately, the question is, does this move voters and does this shift politics?
Now, one really interesting development in Australia was the starting of an inquiry into human rights abuses in China and Hong Kong. There's been a big push in Parliament, especially from a number of senators who want foreign interference looked at, but this is quite another step to say we want to go after China for human rights abuse.
Look, this is a significant step, and it was reported on Wednesday that there will be a joint inquiry in the Parliament into Magnitsky Sanctions Act. That was an act that the US passed after a Russian whistleblower on corruption was murdered. Essentially, the US has an act of their parliament which gives it the ability to target individuals who've been involved in human rights sanctions and deny them visas, freeze them out from financial systems. Australia is now going to look at whether we should do the same, and we're doing that in the light of prominent human rights abuses in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. So the Joint Committee will consider this. I think they start hearings in January, and then they'll recommend back to the Parliament March or April whether we should develop this kind of act and start to implement it. And that would be a big step for Australia, and I think a positive step.
There is always a bit of consternation when people start doing this, looking at human rights abuses in China, because it's seen as lecturing to a superpower, one that's very critical for Australia. Do you think that it's something that will even get the notice of the Chinese when we start criticising them for this, or is it just going to perhaps affect our relations with them?
Look, I think it would be wrong to view this as only about China. I mean, certainly you would expect that some of the actions taken in Hong Kong and Xinjiang would come into the purview of this kind of inquiry. But there are other parts of the world where Australia has a view on human rights abuses, and I think it's just a way of clearly setting what our standards are. I mean, we don't want to welcome someone into this country who has been convicted of committing human rights abuses in another country. So I think it makes a lot of sense to have a mechanism to be able to take that sort of action or deny people enjoying the rights that the Australian government can provide them with.
And do you think it will be effective? What would happen with this inquiry once they examine these issues?
Well, these inquiries give people an opportunity to make submissions, so I expect you would see some prominent human rights organisations laying out their arguments for what they're seeing happen in China and elsewhere, and what sort of view they think Australia should take, and what that means for individuals who might want to come to Australia or conduct business with Australia. So it will certainly be an opportunity to look in detail at a lot of those issues, and also to get some views on the record from our parliamentarians about what they think about what is happening in places like Xinjiang. We've actually heard from surprisingly few members of the parliament about what they think about what is happening there.
We can see those photos just on the bottom right hand of your screen. The Prime Minister's just arriving for his press conference at Canberra Airport, talking about increased security. So we will go live to that when he does start to speak. Well, we can see there he's meeting with those security, he's going to be the police who will be guarding airports. The first ones will be in Brisbane and Canberra, and those are some pretty impressive weapons there. James, what do you make of this push, 135 new officers to patrol all the airports in Australia that have international flights? This is an increasing concern about the threat of terrorism in Australia. Do you think it's going to be pretty confronting for people going to the airport and seeing this kind of machinery around?
Yeah, look, we've travelled to the UK and the US and seen these sorts of weapons in the hands of police officers at airports. Now we'll be seeing it in Australian airports. We've seen it in our parliament for the last 3 years because of the threats our parliament has faced. That's been something new. I think we've had some very real terrorist threats against our airports. It's only a couple of years ago that we saw those brothers trying to put explosive components into meat grinders going through Sydney Airport. So the threat is very real. The AFP has long had presences at all of our airports, but this now gives them that rapid reaction force and the firepower they need to stop any threat. It also allows us to meet our obligations to our international partners as well, so that we can continue to enjoy access to their airports and their immigration services.
One of the things I found interesting with this, and I'm sorry, I know this is completely questions without notice, but we've been covering this for quite some time. Part of this was that the AFP officers would get extra powers, that they can stop anyone and frisk them, they can ask anyone to leave, and they don't necessarily need any evidence. It's just a suspicion of any kind of nefarious intentions. Do you think that this is a concern just on the human rights perspective? At the time, a lot of people were saying that we're giving police far too much power.
Look, I think we do have to be careful about giving police additional powers, and I'm most familiar with New South Wales, where events like APEC and World Youth Day, we've given police quite extraordinary powers in very broad geographic areas. But airports are controlled spaces, and I think most people would accept that airports are very controlled spaces. So I think that's one of the examples where giving police a little bit more latitude to work on their judgment and to make immediate calls is more acceptable than were it to be in the Sydney CBD or elsewhere, for example.
Absolutely, and we will go to that press conference when it begins in a moment. But just finally, Iran is also becoming big news on the global stage. Potentially more US troops being sent to the Middle East just to deal with the growing threat there. What's caused Iran to really flare up in the last few weeks?
Well, I have to say credit to the Trump administration on their maximum pressure campaign on Iran. I was one of the people that was very sceptical about their decision to back out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran. But by tightening US sanctions on Iran, they seem to have caused an economic downturn and put a lot of pressure on the regime. They've had to tighten and ration fuel supplies. That has led to a lot of protests, and we've seen nearly 1,000 deaths in the Iranian protests in the last month or so, and some pretty horrific reports of Iranian Revolutionary Guards gunning down protesters from the back of trucks, although that's still to be internationally verified. It's a sign that the regime is under pressure. We've seen Iranian consulates in southern Iraq being burnt to the ground. There's a lot of dissatisfaction with the regime. The US is continuing to put pressure on them. Despite all of that, though, they're still making progress in those areas that we're concerned about. Secretary of State Pompeo mentioning this week that Iran has potentially now got nuclear-capable ballistic missiles. Not that they've got the nuclear weapons ready to put on them, but the ballistic missiles they've been developing could now theoretically have nuclear payloads, and that's very concerning for that region.
Absolutely. James Brown, thank you for your time and for helping us examine some of the politics in Canberra today. Thank you.
Thanks, Annalise.